Alright, today is October 28th. Today, Guild Wars 2 did a live stream on Guild Wars 2 Balance Philosophy with Cal and Roy, who is,
I think we fumbled through the outro long enough.
a bit jacked right now. His neck is the size of my thighs. So if any of you are interested, that is up there among the very important news. Afterwards, they released the Guild Wars 2 Balance Philosophy manifesto thing here, and we're going to read through this, and if there's anything that they said in the broadcast that is not here in the written part, I will point that out. Let's jump into it. Let's see, this is written by Ruby. Hi all, I have a message from the Skills and Balance lead Cal Cohen. Hi everyone, today we'll be going over our current balance philosophy for Guild Wars 2. Our goal is to give you all insight into some of the things we consider while working on balance. This is a living document. Our balance philosophy has changed over the years and it will continue to adapt as needed for the health of the game. They did go into a little bit of detail on this, both in the past and today. When they say living document, they basically mean that their only rule is, you know, they shouldn't adhere themselves to rules. For example, for a long time, they were like, you know, the elite spec should have trade-offs. Soul Beast, you can't pet swap. Recently, they were like, you know what, this was a dumb idea. Just give it back. And they gave Soul Beast back the ability to pet swap. You know, things like that. But basically, their number one rule, they said on the broadcast, is the game should be fun. After that comes everything else. Okay, when the philosophy needs to be adjusted, we'll communicate what is changing and why. This document will cover some ideas that are not perfectly represented in the current state of the game. We'll be working to resolve any balance issues that don't align with the philosophy, but this is something that will happen incrementally over time. Goals. Fundamentally, our goal is to ensure that the moment-to-moment gameplay in Guild Wars 2 is enjoyable for as many players as possible. To that end, we are deleting Guardians. Sorry, misread that. To that end, we want to capitalize on the depth of the combat system to build a fluid and fast-paced combat experience that allows players to express their mastery of mechanics. We also want to create a substantial number of viable build options and allow for a broad set of combat strategies in order to enable a wide range of playstyles. Something I mentioned earlier on the stream is something I greatly appreciate. You know, I came from World of Warcraft, and at the time I left, you got 1 talent point every 15 levels, and you made one choice of 3 options. There were very few builds. It was very hard to get the build wrong, but on the flip side, every warrior you ran into in PvP had the exact same build. Every Death Knight you ran into had the exact same build. I like that things are super flexible in this game. The downside of that flexibility is it's very easy to make a terrible build, and you occasionally have people that just hit max level, and then they're shocked to find out they're doing 1/20th of the damage that their class could actually put out. And that's just because they're... You know, this game, in my opinion, easy to pick up, very hard to master compared to some other games if you compare it to them. Combat depth and build complexity. Guild Wars 2 has a deep combat system, and players have a very wide range of mastery of its mechanics. To put things simply, we want to build a game that is both rewarding and accessible for all types of players. We want to design builds that allow players with a high level of mastery to demonstrate their prowess and be appropriately rewarded in terms of effectiveness. At the same time, we want to ensure that there are builds for every profession that require less mastery to be effective. On the live stream, they actually said low-intensity builds. And for those of you that have been on my YouTube channel for a while, you know that I've made some. I was not the first person to post them, but many of us content creators have made LI or low-intensity builds, which are builds that... different people have different definitions of them. Some people say that they're builds where you have a low number of key presses per minute. One of my definitions was, you know, you could play it with one hand if you had to, as long as you had like a gamer mouse, you know, stuff like that. But basically, it's a build you could play that's very chill, but it would still get the job done. But there are other builds that are more try-hard that could do a lot more if you were up for that. Okay, these builds should allow players to succeed in parties and clear content, while still having room for them to improve their mastery over the combat system and increase their effectiveness. This is also an important consideration for balancing competitive game modes, as the builds that are effective can vary significantly between different levels of mastery. Our goal is to create a fun and diverse metagame for as many players as possible, and that involves addressing builds that are problematic at any level, even if they aren't problematic at every level. When bringing down a build that only overperforms at a particular level, we'll try to target changes to minimize the impact on other levels or attempt to otherwise compensate in a way that is less problematic at the targeted level. This is a direct, unspoken reference to the recent Catalyst thing that happened. For those that don't know, months ago, there was Catalyst, when played at the absolute pinnacle of their ability, something I'm not capable of, were insane. But it required a lot of conditions to be met. And so there were some really, really top parties and raids that were clearing them in record-breaking time with like 8 Catalysts in the party and 2, like, buff bots with them. So at the time, they nerfed all Catalysts. And the thing is, 99% of Catalysts aren't nearly as good as those people that they were aiming that nerf at. So this is basically them regretting that they did that and trying to fix that. A reverse example that was more like a year or two ago, or it might still be happening, but it was like a year or two ago for me, when I was, a much newer player and I was playing through like, the silver PvP brackets, Mesmers. Mesmers were just running around, they were just slamming keys and deleting everybody. But at the high levels, they were fine. So they were never really getting nerfed, but they were dominating the lower brackets. And even the Mesmers themselves didn't know which character they were. They would summon clones, completely lose track of themselves, make some Naruto noises, kill everybody. It was so deadly because nobody knew how to handle it, not even the Mesmers themselves. So that would be an example where maybe some sort of targeted nerf that aimed at them at the lower brackets would have been necessary. Not saying that still is now, just sharing a story from the past. Link to the article, I'll drop it in the Twitch chat for you. All right, gameplay roles. Roles are the general play style a player wants to achieve, and they determine which responsibilities a player fulfills in a group scenario. For the purpose of balance, we consider a few main roles for each game mode. While not every build needs to perfectly fit into a role, these are the most common archetypes that we look at when balancing. Within a role, we want different builds to have different strengths and weaknesses, and therefore different considerations when building a composition. There will always be some overlap. Damage dealers are all good at dealing damage, but the secondary elements should be different enough that each build feels unique. PvE. PvE group compositions are typically built to maximize damage output through high might, fury, quickness, and alacrity uptime, with just enough support and defense to keep everyone alive. Damage dealer, the primary source of damage. Built to maximize damage output, they bring minimal group utility, though they may share some offensive boons in limited amounts. Boon support, a hybrid role focused on providing high uptime of key offensive boons. Think like a DPS mechanist that provides alacrity, or a Condi firebrand that provides quickness to their group. Though a single build should not provide both quickness and alacrity. This also contributes to damage and healing in lesser amounts than dedicated builds for those roles. This line here, one build should not provide quickness and alacrity. Going back in time quite a bit, there was a long period of time where chronomancers were the only people that could do that, and they were mandatory for every single party. Every group was just like LF Chrono, everyone else GTFO, and they don't want to return us to that. They don't want us to go back to that. So, for example, right now, there is a way that a mechanist could give themselves permanent uptime on quickness, but they can't give it to a party. But they can give a party alacrity. And if you were to build for doing both of those things, your damage would take your damage goes down when you're giving the party alacrity, and it would go down again giving yourself quickness. You'd rather have somebody else give you quickness. That's more of an open world thing. That's like a Lord Heisen build trying to do all of that at once. But that's the kind of thing they're talking about. Healer, a support build that focuses on keeping allies alive through defensive boons and raw healing. They may also provide some offensive boons to the party. Perfect example of this was recently, they nerfed a druid's ability to give 25 might to their party. Druids were able to give 25 might stacks to not only the party, the whole raid. And they nerfed the ability to do that, but at the same time, they added, every time an engineer uses Rifle 2, they give 5 might to their group. They added many skills like that, and through the overlap of those spillover might stacks from people not even realizing they're doing it, you've still got 25 might in most groups without even having to think about it. So, and they also added a bunch of other quality of life things for druids, so druids aren't really complaining about the loss of that one thing that they used to be able to do. World versus world. World v World group compositions have a similar makeup to PvE group compositions, with a focus on damage dealers to deal damage and support characters to defend them. Stability is always in high demand and is essentially a requirement for every group. This has historically been a bit of a problem if you care about diversity in your groups. Guardian supports have always been prevalent in World v. World. They could do the healing. Druid could also do the healing. A Tempest can also do the healing. But the Guardian can also give a ton of stability to the group, and then they're immune to crowd control for a while and, survive the enemy. Scrapper, does quite well also. With they have some access to stability with defense field, and then many other skills such as the ability to cure conditions on teammates while moving, things like that. But Druid had no place in World v. World as a support. Tempest, it was really awkward, and they're working on spreading the strengths of the Guardian around to the other classes to try to allow more options. I, for one, like that. Support is a broad term, and there are a variety of distinct tools that can be the focus of a support build in World v. World, including healing, Condi removals, boons, crowd control, and other general utility tools. Most support builds bring more than one tool to the table, but it's important that a single build can't excel at too many things. Yeah, well, that's what they're working toward. That's not what it is right now. Damage dealer. These are builds that primarily exist to deal damage, obviously, but they also commonly bring additional pressure tools, such as boon removal or crowd control. As fights get larger, area of effect damage becomes more important, and single target pressure loses some of its value. Player versus player. Over the years, we've seen metagames dominate. Wow, that was... Yeah, so I guess they've really only got two... composition types for World v. World, just DPS and supports. That's it. But they're not wrong. PvP. This is, of course, in reference to Conquest, the 5v5 game mode in PvP. To a lesser extent, there's 2v2 and 3v3, but they're mostly talking about the 5v5 game mode. Over the years, we've seen metagames dominated by both teamfight compositions built around the support role and more split compositions built around bruisers or mobility. Ideally, we'd like to get to a state where multiple styles of team compositions are available. Yeah, they're absolutely right. I mean, I've been covering Guild Wars 2 for a couple years now, and in that time, there have been metas where, if one team has just got, really high damage people, they just... they just, heralds just teleport on you and just pop you like a balloon. Just the DPS could get so high, it was unreal, you couldn't mitigate it, and, that was a meta, just whichever team popped the other first. There was another meta, I remember, this is before Scrappers got their trade-off for a while, where Scrappers with hammers on a point took 4 people to take them down. They were just like little slow raid bosses. If you had two Scrappers sitting on a point, you just ignored them, and it was like 2 Reinhardts hitting each other, and the rest of the players would just 4v4 on the rest of the map, and they would get top damage, top healing at the end because they never died the entire fight. There's also metas where supports themselves were unkillable, and later they ended up removing most of the amulets in PvP that had really high stats of healing power plus toughness or healing power plus vitality because the supports would never die. So we've seen many different metas. All they've been trying to chase this balance, and they were, I don't want to say they were set back to square one, but they had a whole new slew of work to do when the new specs came out. Bladesworn, Willbender, Harbinger, Spectre. Spectre just got nerfed, maybe over nerfed, but it was bad. So those are examples of stuff that they had to fix. Support. This role empowers or defends allies. They are most valuable in larger fights where their lack of damage is made up for or by other teammates. Most supports are good healers and have access to group Condi cleansing, but beyond that, they may specialize more in defense. Defensive boons, healing, and cleansing. Offense, offensive boots, crowd control, and personal damage, or a mix of both. I've lately been playing Druid support in PvP, and it's kind of like an offensive support. It throws out immobilizes, dazes, and also throws healing around at the same time, and a moderate amount of damage. A more defensive support would be the stereotype Guardian that's running around. Like, yeah, they can do some burning stacks and stuff, but if you've got any measure of sustain, you're fine. But it's really only going to take out the really glassy people with that. But they do exist. Team fight damage dealer. These are damage builds that typically sacrifice some defensive options for offense. This is referring to downstate elementalists. They have foregone all defense, in fact, in all of their hit points as well, and they are just doing heaps of damage. With the assumption that they will usually be fighting alongside a support role. Their defensive tools are more often focused on hard mitigation with minimal self-sustain. Bruiser. These are bulkier damage dealers who trade some damage for more self-survivability and crowd control. They are generally good team fighters, but they can also flex on the side node in some matchups. Roamer. This is commonly a bursty damage dealer with high mobility. The stereotype for this includes thieves, willbenders, and heralds right now, I would say. They look to capitalize on number-based advantages and end fights quickly. Maybe not Herald, they might not have the mobility, but you get the idea. They have some defensive capabilities, but are usually unable to stay in drawn-out fights. Side note, the Duelist. They're most effective in 1v1s and smaller fights, but can sometimes flex into team fights. I'll drop that for the Twitch chat. Skill and trait design guidelines. The following are a few key ideas that we consider when balancing skills and traits. The list isn't intended to be an absolute in all cases, but there should be a strong reason when a skill breaks one of these rules. Going back really quickly, they did discuss that there's absolutely going to be builds, especially with a massive flexibility of the trait system, that do not fit into one of these or may have some overlap. For example, if any of you have seen any of the recent videos I've done where I played Scrapper and it was a very high mobility Scrapper PvP build. It was very glassy, but it was very high damage and insane mobility with rocket boots. And I was just zooming around the map, picking people off, rezzing people with function gyro, stuff like that. Like, you could say that that was a roamer. It was also absolutely a team fight damage dealer. It could do a lot of damage in a team fight as well, but it wasn't going to go to a side node and like win a fight versus a bruiser or anything like that. So it definitely, that's just one example of something that overlaps between two areas. Okay, purity of purpose, and this is not in reference to the engineer trait. Purity of purpose is the idea that a skill or trait or weapon, etc. should have a well-defined identity. In other words, skills should not do too many different things at once. So, for example, like, they don't want to have an ability that is a stun break and cures 2 conditions off you and, gives your mech a portion of your stats and also is a shadow step and teleports you 1,200 feet, and when it's not on cooldown, it gives you 30% movement speed. Oh, crap. Anyway, in other words, skills should not do too many different things at once. Some common skill identities include damage, defense, support, control, and mobility. Holes in roles. This is an idea similar to purity of purpose, but applied to builds or professions. As we touched on when discussing identity, we want every profession to have distinct strengths and weaknesses. Professions should have things that they excel at, things that they are less effective at than other people, and some things that they simply cannot do. If one profession does everything and has no holes, there's no reason for players to play anything else. Noxxi, can you make me look like the PTSD dog with like Guardian logos flashing above me with 50% opacity right here? Thank you. Power budget. For a given skill or trait, there is a power budget that can be spent on individual elements. A skill that only deals damage can deal X damage, but if that skill also applies conditions or provides other value, then it needs to deal less damage to stay within the budget. In the context of a weapon, the budget is considered across the entire kit, so some skills may be weaker than average in order to allocate more power to a particular skill. Budget can also vary depending on a skill's cooldowns. Skills with longer cooldowns are generally more powerful. Trait budgets are to be considered on a per-tier basis. Adept traits should have less power than Grandmaster traits. Play and counterplay. So just going back to power budget, it basically just means like, if a skill hits really, really hard, they want it to have a longer cooldown or a very long casting time so that people can, possibly avoid it or dodge it or something like that. If it, it does conditions, it will do less power damage. If it does really high power damage, it shouldn't have, a lot of conditions attached to it and things like that. Thank you, Thunder Punch. Play and counterplay. Counterplay is a fundamental piece of competitive gameplay in Guild Wars 2, and it's important to build the skills that can be interacted with effectively. This means that generally we don't want instant cast skills that are heavily impact an enemy, because we want players to be able to see and react to what their opponents are doing. Instant skills are usually best as defensive skills, though we also want to avoid instant healing in significant amounts. A perfect example that jumps to mind is the Hollow Smith Prime Light Beam. When they use it, there's a second or two animation of them pulling out a bazooka made of light. They drop down on knee, they aim it, it charges up a big Kamehameha on the front, and then it fires. You have a chance to dodge out of the way if you were looking at them and you saw them doing it, unless they snuck up behind you. That's a perfect, it's a powerful skill. It hits you with knockdowns, I believe some burns, and it does some damage as well. So that's an example of big wind up, but then big boom right after. Minimizing bad choices. This is just another way of saying that we want as many build components as possible and dash weapons. Okay, what do they mean here? As many components as possible, dash weapons, slot, skills, traits, etc. Dash to have situations they are viable in. Dude, just spell check, guys. Just standard spell check would have caught this. To have situations that they are viable in. Some skills may be restricted to more niche applications, but we want to avoid cases where a skill simply has no relevant use case. It made me so happy to hear them talk about this on the live stream, because I have mentioned multiple times. I've done guides on all 10 classes. All 9 classes. See that? I just keep making up an extra one. All 9 classes. I really say I know 3 pretty fluently because I play them a lot. I enjoy playing them the most. That's Necro, NG, and Ranger. All of them have skills that are used like never. Not many of them. Like for a Ranger, Guard. It's a shout that makes your pet take a portion of the team's damage for a couple seconds. Glyph of Alignment. Glyph of Unity. Glyph of, there was a cheeky thing you could do to kill Deimos really fast, Glyph of Unity, and they immediately nerfed it, and now it's back to nobody uses it. There's just a handful of skills here, literally not used in any game mode. And there are multiple classes of stuff like that. I would very much like to see them somehow tweaked to be useful somewhere. So them saying that one of their goals is that every skill should have a use somewhere makes me really happy, because it's not that way now, but if they're chasing that dream, that's going to make for a good game. This could sometimes be difficult when considering the needs of multiple game modes, but that leads to our next topic, skill splits. Really quickly to explain this for anyone who doesn't know, a skill split is when a skill behaves differently in different game modes. For example, a Ranger has a heal skill called We Heal as 1. In PvE, it's got a 16-second cooldown. In PvP, it starts at 30 and goes down from there, because all heals have to have around a 30-second cooldown in PvP. Otherwise, people are just healing too much. You cannot have a 16-second cooldown heal in PvP. It's just different. Frost Trap on Ranger was way too little damage to be useful anywhere, so they made it do like 4 times the damage, but in PvE only. So you see it sometimes used by like Power Soul Beast in a fractal group, but they didn't want it to suddenly be bursting people, to death in PvP, so they made that change in PvE only. Those are some recent examples of skill splits. Okay, so Guild Wars 2 has 3 primary game modes that are considered for balance: PvE, PvP, and World v. World. Each of these modes require different balance considerations, and it's not always possible to design a skill or trait that fills the need of every game mode without any adjustments. Skill splits began as a system that allowed adjusting a skill or trait's effectiveness between game modes while maintaining consistent functionality in every game mode. If a skill applied quickness, it was required to apply quickness in every game mode with different durations. Over the years, we've seen the limitations of this approach, and we believe that the needs of each mode are different enough that skill splits also need to include some mechanical or functional changes. For example, there was a couple of classes that were able to give themselves a quickness and completely lost that in PvP because it was just too much. We've started to make broader splits over the last few months. When we decided a functional split is necessary, we still want the general purpose of a given skill or trait to be consistent across all game modes. Defensive skills should be defensive skills, but the way a skill provides that defense may be different between modes. One example they gave on the broadcast was like maybe it will give Aegis here, but in that game mode it'll give protection. In case where the core mechanic of a skill or trait is problematic in a particular game mode, we'll investigate if there's a way to rework the mechanic that feels good for every game mode. In extreme cases, we may decide to significantly adjust how a skill behaves in a single mode, but this would only happen if the skill causes a major balance issue. There isn't a viable rework, and the skill cannot be balanced effectively while respecting the usual considerations of skill splits. Ideally, we want to avoid splits of this nature as they significantly increase the learning curve for players who play multiple game modes, but we will still utilize them when necessary. Incorporating player feedback. The final topic we want to touch on is how we utilize player feedback throughout the design process for a balance update. Every update starts by determining what changes we want to make. We do this by reviewing recent live data for each game mode to identify overperforming and underperforming builds, but also by reading through player feedback to check for common pain points. After we have a plan, we design, prototype, play test, and iterate until we've taken our initial goals and turned them into a finished set of changes, ready for wider community feedback. On the stream, they specifically said that they very much read like 80% of what they can on the forums. Like they read as much as they can to try to see what the pain points that players are currently experiencing are. Once we get to the preview stage, we collect players' feedback from a wide variety of channels. At this point, feedback is even more important, as it gives us insight into what potential problems exist in the upcoming update and what things we need to resolve between the preview and the live release. Every change that makes it to the preview is there for a reason, and it's important for us to provide that reasoning to make sure that everyone is aware of our goals. When community sentiment is negative around a particular change, it's important for us to understand why that is so that we may consider these reasons against the initial reason for the change and determine whether there's a viable solution. Hi, Chip. Chip says hi. So on that topic, they were discussing, I don't want to say discussing, they were referencing, recently they did a patch where they said, on a Friday, they said, hey, we're nerfing the absolute crap out of Warriors. That was a patron, thank you. They said, hey, on Monday, we're nerfing the crap out of Warriors. They came in Monday and were shocked to see that the forums were on fire. And they're like, don't do this, this will kill the class. And they're like, well, sorry, we can't stop it now. And then the patch hit. And lo and behold, the thousands of players that responded were right. They didn't allow themselves enough time. They have said that they regretted that. They wish they hadn't done it that way, and they're not going to do it that way again. So now, they basically say, hey, these changes are coming. We're making this change. Here's why. And as a player, I love that. Another game I enjoy sometimes is Path of Exile. Path of Exile, they do their patch notes where they just say, problem, this is doing too much damage. Solution, Guardians have been deleted. Problem, Sikkim is doing too much damage. Solution, Sikkim in PvP only now does 25% less damage. We'll revisit this if we have to. It's just problem, solution, problem, solution, problem, solution. I love when they tell us why they're doing something and not just, we're doing this. Because you're always going to have people that don't see the whole picture. They might be like, we're nerfing Weaver damage by 20%. And you're going to get some guy that's like, what? How dare you? My Weaver I'm having enough trouble already. And then if you say, because 60% of Weavers are doing more damage than the other 8 classes, then the complaining person might be like, oh, shoot, I'm bad at Weaver. Then he might get the big picture. So I very much like when companies do this sort of patch notes. I hope they continue that. I hope they continue doing that. So one last note about previews and feedback. Mechanical changes are the things we focus on the most in the feedback phase. We do still look at feedback around numerical changes, but a lot of the time these can be more difficult to evaluate on paper, and we usually want to get some actual data on how they play out. Right, so if they say, hey, Spike Trap, now in PvP, has half the cooldown, but it no longer does damage, but it's just an unblockable stun with a very low cooldown, we can understand that. But if they say, hey, we're lowering the base damage of Prime Light Beam by 150, and then people are complaining, but then they didn't take into account like a Berserker Amulet and power scaling, and then they need to look up the ratio scaling for Prime Light Beam with power and apply that with a Berserker Amulet. It's a lot harder for people to decide if they should complain. Okay, no, it's not hard for people to decide if they should complain. It's a lot harder for educated people to decide if they should complain or not when it's just numbers getting thrown around. But if it's mechanics, it's pretty easy to tell whether you like or dislike something just by what they're talking about. We do still look at feedback around numerical changes, but a lot of the time these can be more difficult to evaluate on paper, and we usually want to get some actual data on how they play out. Numerical changes are also much easier to tune in later updates, even outside of the regular balance cycle. This isn't to say that numerical changes will never get adjusted because of player feedback. They're just a lower priority for us compared to any of the larger mechanical updates. Player feedback is an extremely valuable tool in the game design process. Thanks to everyone who regularly contributes to the discussion. It's true. It's true. They really, really do value our feedback. For example, when they first asked us if we were interested in World v. World Alliances, they collected feedback for like 7 years before they continued. They absolutely want to make sure they make the most people happy as possible, and I a little bit apologize for that one. That's just low-hanging fruit. Conclusion. Hello, Chip. Conclusion. As we mentioned back at the start, going forward we'll be working to identify areas where the philosophy can be improved and resolved while any outstanding issues where the live game doesn't align with the philosophy. One final note, we've found the opportunity to gather initial feedback from either preview streams or forum posts to be incredibly valuable over the last few months, and we'd like to try to find more ways to get the community involved early. Finding the proper timing is the hard part, as we want to make sure we have enough time to put together an impactful update, but we'll be thinking about ways that we can improve the current process. Thanks everyone for reading. We're looking forward to following the discussion. Calcium C. Cohen, Skills and Balance Lead. So one thing that's worth pointing out there is I'm distracted by my cat. The Guild Wars 2 game does not have a PTR. It's got a much smaller team working on it than something like Blizzard, and they have to work around that. By not having a PTR and not having, downtime, where the game is always online, they don't take it down on Tuesdays like many other MMOs. There are pros and cons to it. Pros, we get more playtime. Cons, occasionally something gets live that we really don't like. And that's what they're working on trying to fix now. So hopefully, read as written, I like all of this. I like all of this. I've given you some examples of all of it in action. I hope that they continue to do it. It is no secret that many times ArenaNet has said like we're doing X, and they have either done Y or they've just never done X and then just tried to pretend it never happened. So this is fantastic. It's been fantastic for a few months now. I hope that they continue down this path, and so fingers crossed. If you got any questions, comments, thoughts, concerns about any of this, be sure to put them in the comments down below. And of course, I will have a link to this at the top of the description if you want to see it for yourself. That's all for now. Have a good weekend, and I'll be back with more Guild Wars 2 news.